We're gonna run through everything that you need to know to shoot in manual mode, get out of auto in 10 minutes. Let's dive into it. Why is manual so good to shoot in? Well, ultimately it just gives you a huge amount of control. For me, going from auto to manual was one of the biggest steps for improving my photography, for getting the control, getting the look that I wanted to go for. And essentially, yes, the auto mode is really good actually. It's an amazing way of being able to take photos without really having to know too much about the settings and things like that you need to do, but it doesn't allow you any kind of control over the look of the photo, and ultimately your camera isn't going to know how you want the photo to look. It's just going to try and expose it the way it thinks that it should be exposed. Not ideal compared to having the full control over the full look of the photo. Manual photography using aperture, shutter speed, ISO allows you to do that, allows you to get the exact look and exposure and all that kind of stuff that you want. Now, of course, you don't always have to shoot in manual. I don't always shoot in manual. Sometimes I'll shoot in aperture priority, shutter priority. We can get into that later and in another video as well. But ultimately, knowing how to shoot in manual is really important. It means you can choose not to, but it's much better than not shooting in manual because you don't know how. So let's get into exactly what you need to know in order to be able to shoot in manual mode. Now, there's 3 settings you're gonna have to deal with: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. They all contribute to the overall brightness of the image, and then they all have another side effect that affects the look of the image as well. Let's start off with aperture. Now, aperture is measured as an f-stop number. So for example, f/4, f/8, and so on. You get the idea. It generally runs between around f1.2 to around f22, but some lenses can go outside of that as well. Now, this actually affects the lens itself rather than the camera, and essentially it is affecting how big the aperture in the lens is, and the bigger that is, the more light it's going to let into the camera, which is going to make the image a brighter image. So essentially, the bigger the aperture, the brighter the exposure. Now, conversely to what you would think, and unfortunately, this is just one of those things you just have to get used to, the smaller the number, the bigger the aperture. So f1.4, for example, is a really wide open aperture. f16, it's very much closed down, a very much smaller aperture in the lens. So that's something you have to get used to, that the numbers are kind of the backwards way to the way you would initially think that they would work. So if you look at this image, this is taken at f1.8. So this is nice and bright. If I now take that aperture and stop it down to something like f8, it's darker, and then f16, it's darker again. So that is directly affecting how much light is coming in through that lens and hitting the sensor in the camera. So that's one part of affecting the brightness, the exposure of your image. The next part is shutter speed. Now, this is essentially measuring how long the shutter is open, or realistically with mirrorless cameras, this is affecting how long your sensor is exposed to the actual light. How long is that light going to be hitting the sensor for? And this is measured in terms of time. So for example, 1/100th of a second, that's how long the sensor is going to expose. 1/200th, 1/2000th of a second, that's how it's measured. Now, of course, the faster the shutter speed is, the less time that sensor is going to be exposed to light, and therefore the less light is going to hit. Whereas the slower the shutter speed, down to sort of 1/10th of a second, 1/5th of a second, even a second, 2 seconds, more light is going to be hitting that sensor, so it will be a brighter image. If you look at this photo, this is taken at 1/100th of a second. We can then bring that shutter speed down to 1/10th of a second and look how much brighter this is. All the other settings are the same. Then let's bring that up to 1/400th of a second. And that's going to make the shot a lot darker. The exposure is a lot darker. So you can see how long you're leaving that open is massively affecting how bright, how exposed that image is. Now, the third setting we need to talk about is the ISO. Now, this is different to the other two. It's not directly affecting things like the shutter or the aperture or anything like that. It's essentially just affecting how sensitive your sensor is to light. How sensitive is it to the light that's hitting it? And you can think of this a little bit like a gain dial or a volume dial on a guitar amp or something like that. You can turn it up to make it louder, or in this case brighter, and turn it down to make it quieter, or in this case darker. So this photo is taken at ISO 100, and you can see it's a little bit darker, and then let's bump that up to ISO 500. That's a bit brighter. ISO 1000, that's brighter again. So that is directly affecting just how bright your image is going to be based on the sensitivity of your sensor to the light. So it's an easy way of just turning up the brightness for your photo. Now, of course, all of these settings have side effects as well as affecting the exposure, the brightness of the photo. So for example, the aperture, and you may have noticed this when we were showing the photos, the aperture affects the depth of field, and that means how much of the image is in focus. Now, a very wide open, a very big aperture is going to have a very shallow depth of field. So for example, this photo, f1.4, which is a very shallow depth of field, means that just the one camera is in focus. Whereas if I stop that down to f5.6, for example, we're going to have much less of a blurred background and the other camera more in focus. And then if I stop that down again to something like f8 or f11, it's going to be even more in focus, even less of a blurred background. So that's a great way of affecting the kind of creative look of your photo. So while the aperture absolutely affects how much light is coming in through the lens, you can also affect the actual depth of field within the photo. Now, this is great for things like portraits, something where you want a blurred background. If you use a lower f-stop number, so a bigger aperture, not only are you letting more light in, but you're going to have a more blurred background, a shallower depth of field. Now, shutter speed, of course, also has a side effect to using a slower or a faster shutter speed. Obviously, it affects how much light is getting onto that sensor because of how long it is exposed to the light. But also that means that it's affecting the action, the movement within the scene. A slower shutter speed is going to capture a longer period of time, and therefore motion is going to look more blurred. Whereas a faster shutter speed is essentially going to be a quick snapshot of a moment that freezes the action. So let me show you what I mean. I'm going to roll this lemon along the surface here, and we're going to use a slower shutter speed to capture the image. So if I use something like 1/40th of a second, I'm going to be letting lots of light to hit that sensor, but it's going to capture the motion over a longer period of time, which is going to leave a little bit of a kind of motion blur to it. And you can see that in this photo. If I use a faster shutter speed, I'm going to be able to freeze that motion because it's such a quick snapshot. So let's bring that up to 1/400th of a second, and that's going to freeze the lemon in place as it's rolling along. So you can use shutter speed to affect the look of your photo with regards to the motion. It's fantastic for letting in more light, but you need to be aware of any motion in the scene, which is going to be affected by having that slower shutter speed. Something else that can affect this is your hand can shake very slightly while you're taking the image. Now, that's not a problem as long as the shutter speed is a little bit higher, a little bit faster, that's not going to be an issue. But if your shutter speed is quite slow, you're going to find that the natural shake in your hand, which you can't avoid because we're all humans, is actually going to result in a slightly blurred image. And this is one of the biggest causes of actual blur in images, or images not being quite so sharp. A good rule of thumb is to use the shutter speed as fast or faster as the focal length you're using. So for example, if you're using a 24 to 70mm lens, if you stay above 1/70th of a second, you're probably going to be fine. Generally speaking, 1/400th of a second is going to freeze pretty much all human motion. And then up from there, 1/500th, 1/800th, 1,000th is going to freeze lots and lots of stuff. If it's a bright sunny day, you don't have to worry about this too much. And unless you specifically want that blur, then actually you can just bring that shutter speed right up to 1,000th, 2,000th a second, and you just won't have to worry about any of that stuff. ISO, of course, does have a side effect as well. The more that you bring that up, the more noise you're going to introduce into your photo. A little bit like turning the volume up on a guitar amp or on a speaker. If you turn it up too high, it's going to start getting a little bit distorted. And that's exactly the same here. We're bringing up that sensitivity to light, and the more we bring it up, the more noise we start to introduce into the image. So this image taken at ISO 100, very clean, very nice. This image taken at ISO 6400, you can see there's a little bit more digital noise there. And then if I bump that all the way up to ISO 12,800, there's a significant more amount of noise in the image. General rule of thumb is try and keep that ISO number as low as possible, because that's generally going to give you the best look, the cleanest look for your image. But with most modern cameras now, you can bump that up to a reasonable level, even up to 3200, To be honest, a lot of cameras, even up to 6400 is absolutely fine. So the goal here is to balance all three of these settings to create a well-exposed image, the correct brightness and all that kind of stuff, while also retaining whatever creative look you want to go for. So let's say it's a portrait, you want to expose it properly, but you might use a shallow depth of field to separate your subject from the background with a nice blurred background. If you're shooting, water smashing against rocks, you want to use a nice fast shutter speed to freeze that water in motion so it's not all blurred. If you're shooting at night, you might bump up that ISO, you might use a lower f-stop number for your aperture, just to try and get as much light in and as much sensitivity to the light as well, to try and get a well-exposed image in the darker sort of parts of the day. And that's essentially it. Manual photography is so much easier than it seems, and once you've learned it, that's it. You've got complete control forever. It really helps you to up your photography. I think it's fantastic. It's a fantastic way of doing things. And like I say, for me, this was one of the biggest steps up in my photography really that happened at all. This, shooting in RAW, which we'll talk about as well, absolutely changed the way that I took photos. Now we're gonna have more videos learning photography, the benefits of shooting in RAW, editing, everything. We're gonna go through everything step by step. Anything you want to see, let me know down in the comments. Any questions about shooting in manual mode, let me know down in the comments as well. I'd love actually to talk about that stuff. So any questions at all, let me know down there and I'll get back to you ASAP. Like and subscribe, that really helps me out. You'll see the new stuff, super exciting. And all that's left for me to say is, as always, thanks for watching.